Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I've been in the business of hunting cryptids for about 12 years now. The job isn't what you'd call glamorous, but it pays well, and it keeps the nightmares at bay. My name is Vincent Hale, and I work for a clandestine branch of the government. Think of us as the cleanup crew for things that shouldn't exist. You won't find our unit mentioned in any official documents or public records. We're the ones called in when the usual explanations don't hold water, when the local authorities start getting nervous about what they've seen in the woods, or when someone's gone missing, and the cops are whispering about curses and monsters. This particular job started out like most others, an urgent briefing in a cold, dimly lit room somewhere in the Midwest. The room smelled of old coffee and sweat, and the faces around the table were grim. No one had slept well in days. Our handler, a no-nonsense woman named Graves, was clicking through a series of grisly photos on the projector screen. 3 people missing, 1 body found, she said, her voice clipped and efficient. Upstate New York, deep in the Adirondacks. Local PD is spooked, but they've been ordered to keep it quiet. Official story is a bear attack. I nodded along with the rest of the team, knowing full well that bear attack was the official explanation for a lot of things that had nothing to do with bears. My gut told me this was going to be one of those cases. The body that was found, Graves continued, was a hiker, 26 years old, male. He was found in a small clearing, about 3 miles from where he was last seen. Half of him anyway. The other half was missing. Completely. And not in a way that makes sense. I leaned forward, studying the image of the mangled body on the screen. The guy looked like he'd been torn apart by something with incredible strength and no particular sense of mercy. The wounds weren't clean. This wasn't the work of a blade or an animal's teeth. It was as if something had wrenched the poor guy apart, like you'd pull the wings off a fly. There's more, Graves added, clicking to the next slide. This one showed an old, grainy photo of a town nestled in the woods. This is Ravens Hollow. It's a small, isolated community about 10 miles from the scene. Population 85. They've lived there for generations. Most don't leave. Those who do don't talk about what's out there. Ravens Hollow had a reputation, even among people like us. It was the kind of place you heard about in rumors. A town where people didn't ask questions and didn't want outsiders poking around. Every few years, someone would go missing, and the locals would close ranks. Most of us figured the town had some dark secret, maybe even a pact with something ancient. We were usually wrong, though, not that it ever stopped us from thinking it. Our mission was straightforward: find whatever was responsible for the deaths and make sure it didn't claim any more lives. Then, clean up the mess, and make sure the official story stuck. We'd done it 100 times before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this one was different. There was something about that body, the way it had been torn apart, something that wasn't sitting right with me. By the time we arrived at Ravens Hollow, it was late afternoon. The town was as eerie as I'd expected, with narrow, winding streets that seemed to twist and turn in on themselves. The houses were old, built from dark wood that had weathered decades of harsh winters. Most of them had their windows shuttered, and the few people we saw on the street hurried away as soon as they spotted us. We set up base in an abandoned hunting lodge about a mile out of town. The place was falling apart, but it had electricity, and more importantly, it was isolated. From there, we could stage our operation without attracting too much attention. Our team consisted of 5 people. Me, the team lead, Quinn, our tracker, Davis, our tech expert, and the newcomers, Ramos and Blake, both former military. I didn't know much about them, but Graves had assured me they were reliable. They didn't talk much, which suited me fine. The first night, we went into the woods where the body had been found. It was dark, with only the light from our flashlights cutting through the dense underbrush. The air was thick with the smell of pine and decaying leaves, and every snap of a twig made us jumpy. We weren't expecting to find anything. The thing we were hunting was smarter than to stick around its kill site, but we needed to get a feel for the area. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first, a drop in temperature, a sudden silence that made your skin crawl. I stopped, holding up a hand to signal the others. We all listened, straining to hear anything in the oppressive quiet. "Quinn," I whispered, "what do you make of this?" Quinn was crouched low, studying the ground with a look of concentration. "There's something here," he murmured. "Something that shouldn't be." He pointed to a patch of disturbed earth, where the undergrowth had been flattened as if something large had moved through. The pattern was odd, not like any animal track I'd seen before. It was more like a drag mark, with deep furrows where something heavy had been pulled along. "Whatever it is," Quinn said, "it's big. And it's fast." I glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees pressed in close, and the darkness felt like it was alive, shifting and moving just out of sight. "Let's move," I said. "We're not sticking around to find out if it's coming back." We returned to the lodge without incident, but the tension was palpable. Everyone was on edge, their eyes darting to the windows every time they heard a noise outside. Even Davis, who usually had his nose buried in his gadgets, was jumpy. The second night, things went bad. We'd split into two teams. Quinn and I heading back into the woods, while Davis, Ramos, and Blake stayed at the lodge to monitor the equipment. We were hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was we were hunting, maybe even track it back to its lair. It was just past midnight when we heard it, a deep rumbling noise that seemed to come from all around us. It wasn't an animal sound. There was something unnatural about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Quinn and I froze, our flashlights sweeping the trees. The noise came again, louder this time, and I realized with a start that it wasn't just one sound, it was a chorus. A low, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. "We need to move," I said, keeping my voice low. "Now." But before we could take another step, something massive burst out of the trees. It moved with blinding speed, a blur of muscle and sinew that slammed into Quinn, knocking him off his feet. I fired off a shot, but the thing was already gone, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I rushed to Quinn's side, but it was too late. He was dead, his body broken and twisted in a way that no human should ever be. I barely had time to register the horror before I heard the sound again, the deep, resonant hum that signaled the creature's return. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran like hell, crashing through the underbrush with no thought but to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I could hear it behind me, tearing through the trees, and I knew that if it caught me, I'd end up like Quinn. I don't know how I made it back to the lodge, but I did. I burst through the door, panting and wild-eyed, to find Davis, Ramos, and Blake already on their feet, weapons drawn. "It's out there," I gasped. "Quinn's gone." There was no time for questions. The creature was close. I could hear it, feel it, like the pulse of a drumbeat, getting faster and faster. We barricaded the door and windows, praying it would hold. The next few minutes were a blur of noise and terror. The creature slammed into the walls, shaking the entire lodge. It roared in frustration. No, not a roar, but a sound like grinding stone, like the earth itself was screaming. I fired blindly through the window, hearing the bullets ricochet off something hard, something that wasn't flesh. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited, guns trained on the door, but the creature didn't return. In the aftermath, we surveyed the damage. The lodge was in shambles, the door nearly off its hinges, the walls cracked and splintered. But there was no sign of the creature. No blood, no tracks, nothing to show that it had ever been there. Except for Quinn. His body lay in the woods, broken and mangled, a grim reminder of what we were up against. We left the next day. There was no point in staying. Our mission was a failure, and we knew better than to push our luck. Graves wasn't happy, but she understood. Sometimes you get the thing you're hunting, and sometimes it gets you. Back at headquarters, we filed our report, full of half-truths and omissions. We never spoke about what really happened, not even to each other. There was no need. We all knew that whatever was out there in those dark, twisted woods was something we were better off forgetting. As we packed up our gear and prepared to head out to our next assignment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the creature was still out there, waiting. But that's the thing about this job. You learn to live with the things you can't explain. You don't dwell on the ones that got away. You just move on to the next hunt and hope to hell that you don't become the prey. I woke up to the sound of the rain pounding against my apartment window, the kind of heavy downpour that made you think twice about stepping outside. I had grown used to it. Rain was a near-constant companion in the Pacific Northwest. My name's Tom Riggins, and for the last 10 years I've been doing a job that most people wouldn't believe even existed. My official title? Field Operative for the Department of Cryptid Containment, a shadowy branch of the government that handles things that go bump in the night, creatures that aren't supposed to exist but do. I wasn't always in this line of work. I used to be a Marine, stationed overseas, where I saw things that would make most people's skin crawl. But it was nothing compared to what I deal with now. There was one mission in particular that changed everything for me, and I often think back on it, wondering how it all spiraled out of control. That mission started like any other, a routine call to investigate strange occurrences in a small town, this time in the dense forests of Oregon. We got the call late in the evening. The town of Calhoun, a speck on the map with barely 100 residents, had reported several disappearances over the past month. The local law enforcement had no leads, and the townsfolk were on edge, some claiming to have seen something in the woods, something big and fast. That's when our team was called in. When regular police work doesn't cut it, that's where we come in. My partner for the mission was Carter Nolan, a guy who had been with the department even longer than me. Carter was a no-nonsense type of guy, the kind who never showed fear, no matter what we faced. He was a lifeline for me on these missions, always a step ahead, always ready with a plan. We loaded up the black SUV with our gear, tranquilizer rifles, silver bullets, high-powered flashlights, and the rest of the standard kit. Carter checked his sidearm and nodded at me. "Ready, Riggins?" "Yeah, let's do this." The drive to Calhoun was uneventful, the rain easing into a light drizzle as we approached the town. It was dark by the time we arrived, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow up the headlights of the SUV. The town was quiet, unnervingly so, as we pulled up to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tate was waiting for us on the front steps, his face lined with worry. He was a big man, with a graying beard and a gut that strained against his uniform. He didn't seem the type to be easily rattled, but I could tell he was on edge. "Evening, Sheriff," I said as we stepped out of the car. "Evening," he replied, his voice gruff. "Glad you boys could make it. We've got ourselves a hell of a situation here." "What exactly are we dealing with?" Carter asked, getting straight to the point. Tate shook his head, looking out towards the dark woods that surrounded the town. "Wish I knew. Folks have been disappearing. 2 hunters, a couple of hikers, and just yesterday one of my deputies. Found his cruiser empty on the side of the road, door wide open, keys still in the ignition." I exchanged a look with Carter. This wasn't sounding like the usual cases we handled. "Any witnesses?" I asked. "A few," the sheriff said, scratching his beard. "But they all sound like they've been hitting the bottle. Talk about seeing some kind of creature. Big as a bear, but faster, they say. Took off into the woods before anyone could get a good look." "Typical," Carter muttered. "Well, let's start with the most recent disappearance. Where did your deputy go missing?" The sheriff led us to the spot where the deputy's cruiser had been found. It was on the edge of town, where the paved road turned to gravel and then to dirt as it wound deeper into the forest. The cruiser was still there, parked under a tall pine tree, looking as if the deputy had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. But we knew better. Carter and I pulled on our rain gear and grabbed our rifles. We weren't taking any chances. The forest was dense, the trees standing like sentinels in the darkness, their branches swaying in the wind. The ground was muddy, our boots sinking into the earth with every step. We moved in silence, scanning the area with our flashlights, looking for any sign of the deputy or whatever had taken him. It didn't take long to find something. Carter was the first to spot it, a trail of blood leading away from the road, disappearing into the trees. It was fresh, the rain having not yet washed it away. We exchanged another look, and without a word, we followed the trail. The blood led us deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker, the air colder. I kept my finger on the trigger, my eyes darting around, expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. The body of the deputy, or what was left of it, was sprawled on the ground, torn apart as if by a wild animal. But no animal I'd ever seen could do this. His limbs were twisted, broken in ways that didn't make sense, and there were deep gashes running across his torso. Carter knelt beside the body, inspecting the wounds. "Claw marks," he said, his voice low. "But these are wrong, too wide, too deep." I scanned the surrounding trees, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "You think it's still out here?" "Could be," Carter replied, standing up. "Whatever it is, it's big, strong, and smart enough to avoid detection until now." As we prepared to move out, something rustled in the bushes nearby. We both froze, our rifles trained on the sound. The rustling grew louder, and then it stepped into the clearing. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a man. But that's where the similarities ended. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms were long, almost dragging on the ground, ending in hands tipped with claws the size of knives. Its face was a twisted, nightmarish version of a wolf, but more grotesque, with an elongated snout and jagged teeth that jutted out at odd angles. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large, the creature lunged at Carter. He fired, the tranquilizer dart striking it in the chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It swiped at him with one massive clawed hand, and he went flying back, hitting the ground hard. I fired next, aiming for its head, but the creature dodged, its movements fluid and unnatural. It turned its attention to me, its lips pulling back in what I could only describe as a sick parody of a smile. I backed up, trying to keep my aim steady, but it was too fast. It was on me before I could get off another shot, knocking the rifle out of my hands and sending me sprawling to the ground. I scrambled to get up, reaching for my sidearm, but the creature was already towering over me, its hot breath on my face. I expected it to finish me off then and there, but instead, it paused, as if studying me. I stared into its face, the twisted wolf-like features, and something clicked. I remembered the reports from earlier, the ones dismissed as drunken ramblings. The creature wasn't a wolf, but it had the same cunning, the same ferocity. Then with a snarl it turned and bounded off into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my rifle, checking on Carter. He was hurt but conscious, a deep gash running down his arm where the creature had struck him. He grunted as I helped him to his feet. "Things playing with us," he muttered, wincing in pain. "Yeah," I agreed. "But now we know what we're up against." We retreated to the town, regrouping with Sheriff Tate, who took one look at us and knew things had gone bad. We patched Carter up as best as we could, and then we began planning our next move. The creature was smart, stronger than anything we'd faced before, and worst of all, it seemed to enjoy the hunt. But it had made a mistake. It had let us live. We spent the next few hours setting up traps, using every trick in the book to lure the creature out. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. As the night dragged on, the rain returned, heavier than before, drenching everything, turning the ground into a muddy quagmire. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. It was near dawn when we heard it, a distant howl, but distorted, twisted, as if it were being pulled apart and reassembled. We readied ourselves, and soon enough the creature emerged from the woods, its eyes locking onto us. It was different this time, more aggressive, as if it knew we were a threat now. The fight was brutal. The creature tore through our traps with terrifying ease, shrugging off darts and bullets as if they were nothing. It was Carter who finally brought it down, a well-placed shot to the head that sent it crashing to the ground. We approached cautiously, and when it didn't move, we knew it was finally over. It started like any other job, with a knock on the door at an ungodly hour. I rolled out of bed, groggy and half-dressed, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes as I staggered to the door. You'd think, after 10 years in this line of work, I'd be used to it by now, but I wasn't. A man can't really get used to hunting down monsters for a living. It's just something you learn to tolerate, like bad coffee or cold showers. I swung the door open to find Clark standing there, his usually impassive face drawn into a tight line. Clark was a big guy, ex-military, the kind of man who spoke in monosyllables and let his fists do most of the talking. If he was at my door at this hour, it was something serious. "Got a situation," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "We're needed in Oregon." "Oregon?" I rubbed my stubbled chin. "What the hell is in Oregon?" "Trouble," Clark replied, not one for elaboration. "There's been a string of disappearances in the Cascade Mountains. People going missing on well-traveled trails. A ranger's been found torn to shreds." "Torn to shreds?" I echoed. "By what?" "That's what we need to find out." I sighed, running a hand through my unruly hair. The last time we had dealt with something in the wilderness, it hadn't ended well. But that was the job. You didn't get to pick the assignments. You just did them. Clark turned on his heel and headed back to the black SUV idling in my driveway. I grabbed my duffel bag, hastily threw in some gear, and followed him out. We were wheels up within the hour, the darkened streets of Los Angeles quickly fading as we headed north. The early morning silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional grunt from Clark. We arrived in Oregon just as dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the thick canopy of the Cascades. The air was cool and crisp, a far cry from the smoggy heat of LA. I breathed it in, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. A local ranger named Dean was waiting for us at the trailhead, a weathered man in his 50s with a face that had seen too much. He looked at us with a mixture of relief and skepticism. "You guys are the experts?" Dean asked, eyeing our gear. "Something like that," Clark replied curtly. "What's the situation?" Dean led us to the ranger station, where a map of the area was spread out on a table. "5 hikers have gone missing in the past 2 weeks," he said, pointing to various spots on the map. All of them were experienced, knew the area well. Last one was a ranger, good kid. We found what was left of him 3 days ago. Dean swallowed hard. Whatever it wasn't a bear or a cougar. No animal does that kind of damage. Clark leaned over the map, his eyes narrowing. "Where's the body?" Dean hesitated. "I've got it in cold storage, wasn't sure what else to do with it. The sheriff, well, he's out of his depth on this one." "Show us," Clark ordered. Dean led us to a small outbuilding behind the station. The stench hit me as soon as the door opened, a sickly sweet smell that turned my stomach. Inside, a metal table held what was left of the ranger. I'd seen plenty of mangled bodies in my time, but this was something else. The kid was barely recognizable, his torso ripped open, bone shattered, flesh shredded like it had gone through a meat grinder. But it wasn't the brutality that got to me. It was the precision. Whatever had done this had known exactly where to strike, how to kill with maximum efficiency. "Jesus," I muttered, turning away. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Clark didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the body. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Not sure yet, but it's not human." I didn't need him to tell me that. I'd seen enough in this job to know when we were up against something unnatural, something that didn't belong in our world. Dean looked like he was about to be sick. "You think it's some kind of animal?" "No," Clark said flatly. "Not an animal." That didn't leave many options. I exchanged a glance with Clark. He nodded, and I knew we were on the same page. Whatever this was, it wasn't something that could be explained away as a simple predator attack. This was something from the other side, something we were specifically trained to deal with. "We'll need to set up a perimeter," Clark said, snapping back into mission mode. "I want cameras, sensors, the works. We're going to find whatever did this and put it down." Dean just nodded, too shell-shocked to argue. He led us back to the main building where we set up our gear. Clark was a master of logistics, and within an hour, we had the area wired up like a fortress. I set up the cameras, infrared sensors, and motion detectors, while Clark reviewed the footage from the past few days, searching for any sign of our quarry. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, a heavy silence settled over the station, the kind that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. I could sense the tension in the air, the weight of something lurking just out of sight. "We've got company," Clark muttered, staring at one of the monitors. I moved to his side, my eyes scanning the screen. There, in the upper corner, something moved. Too fast to make out clearly, but definitely there. It was large, bigger than any animal that should have been in these woods, and it moved with a purpose, like it knew exactly where we were. "Get ready," Clark said, reaching for his rifle. I did the same, checking the chamber, making sure everything was locked and loaded. The night deepened, the forest swallowing the last of the daylight. We huddled in the station, the only sound the low hum of the monitors and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the stillness. Then it hit. A thunderous crash against the side of the building that rattled the windows and sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. Clark was on his feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. "Stay close," he barked, moving toward the door. I followed, my grip tight on the weapon. We stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. And then I saw it. A shadow, massive and hunched, slinking through the trees. Clark fired, the shot echoing through the woods. The creature barely flinched, its movements quick and calculated. It darted from tree to tree, never staying in one place long enough for us to get a good look. I fired a burst, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the night. The thing let out a noise, not a scream, not a howl, but something in between, something that made my skin crawl. And then it charged. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, closing the distance in seconds. I barely had time to react before it was on me, a blur of claws and teeth. Clark yelled something, but I couldn't hear him over the blood rushing in my ears. I fired blindly, desperately, as the creature lunged. But it didn't go for me. It went for Clark, knocking him to the ground with a force that left me breathless. I scrambled to my feet, raising my rifle, but Clark was already on his back, wrestling with the thing. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Half wolf, half bear, with a face that was almost human in its hatred. Clark roared, slamming the butt of his rifle into its head. The creature snarled, blood spraying from its maw as it snapped at his throat. I moved forward, the world narrowing to the space between me and Clark, me and the monster trying to tear him apart. I took aim, breathing steady, and fired. The bullet found its mark, striking the creature in the side. It reared back, a guttural noise ripping from its throat. No, not guttural. Something worse, something primal and ancient. Clark shoved it off him, scrambling back as I fired again. The creature staggered, blood dripping from its wounds. But it wasn't done. It looked at me, eyes filled with a malevolence that was almost human. I fired again, and this time the bullet caught it square in the chest. It fell, finally, a heavy thud against the earth. Clark and I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body. I'd seen a lot of things in my time, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so wrong. "It's dead," I said, more to myself than to Clark. "Yeah," Clark replied, his voice flat. "It's dead." We didn't linger. We didn't talk about what had happened or what that thing was. We did our job, securing the area, making sure the creature was really down. It was. Its body was still there, cold and heavy, a testament to the fact that this was real. As we packed up to leave, Dean approached, his face pale and drawn. "What was that thing?" "Don't know," Clark replied. "Don't care. It's over." Dean nodded, though the fear in his eyes remained. I didn't blame him. It wasn't something you just shook off. But for us, it was just another day on the job. We loaded the body into the SUV, making sure to seal it tight. Clark drove in silence, the road stretching out before us like a black ribbon. We didn't need to talk. We'd done what we came to do. As we pulled away from the Cascade Mountains, the last remnants of night fading in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but think that there would always be another monster, another hunt. But for now at least, we'd won. We drove on, leaving the horrors behind us for now. When you spend most of your days hunting things that shouldn't exist, you get used to the silence. I suppose it's my way of coping with the job. I'm not a guy who talks a lot, not because I don't like people, but because I don't see the point in talking about things that don't matter. My name's Emmett Reyes, and I've been doing this job long enough to know that when you do talk, it better be something important. White Rock Woods isn't a place you'd find on a map, but I can tell you it's real. Tucked away in a remote corner of Northern California, the woods are dense, dark, and old. Older than the country itself, by some accounts. The locals whisper about it, the kind of place people don't go unless they have to, and for some reason, our unit had to. Orders had come down from the top, and when that happens, you don't ask questions. You just go. I had my doubts about this mission from the start. Not because I was scared. Fear stopped being a thing for me years ago. But because it didn't make sense. We hunt cryptids, creatures that aren't supposed to exist, but do. And usually we know what we're dealing with before we get there. But this time, the brief was vague, even by our standards. Unconfirmed reports of an unidentified creature. That was it. No sightings, no descriptions, just a warning to be on alert. We were 4 hours into the trek when the first sign of trouble hit. It wasn't anything big, just a sound. A distant, almost rhythmic thumping. I stopped, held up a hand to the guys, and we all froze. It wasn't wind or the creak of old trees. It was something else, something alive. Silently, I motioned for us to move on, slower this time. My team consisted of 4 men, each hand-picked for their skills. Erickson, our tracker, was leading the way. He was the best I'd ever seen, able to read the land like a book. Behind him was Clancy, our weapons specialist, and then there was Hutch, a no-nonsense guy who handled all our tech. And then there was me. They called me the closer, because I was the one who ended things when they got bad. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the trees began to change. They weren't just old, they were wrong. The bark was cracked and peeling like skin after a bad sunburn, and the leaves hung limp, gray, and lifeless. The air grew thick, humid and heavy with the smell of rot, even though nothing appeared to be decaying. The thumping sound grew louder, more insistent, and closer. Erickson knelt down to inspect the ground, brushing away a layer of dead leaves. "Tracks," he muttered. "But they're weird, man. Look at this." He pointed to an imprint in the soft earth. A print that looked almost canine but was far too large. The claws were long, longer than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. "Let's keep moving," I said, not wanting to linger in one spot for too long. My voice was steady, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. Birds that should have been chirping were silent. The underbrush, usually teeming with life, was dead still. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. And that thumping, God, that thumping, it never stopped. We set up camp as the light began to fade, knowing better than to travel these woods after dark. I didn't like the idea of staying out in the open, but there wasn't much choice. As we sat around the small fire, the men were quiet, and not because they were tired. Something was off, and we all knew it. "Emmett," Clancy said, breaking the silence. "You ever seen anything like this before?" I shook my head. "No, and I don't like it." "What the hell are we dealing with out here?" Hutch asked, fiddling with his tablet, trying to get a signal that wasn't going to come. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not something we faced before." Erickson stood up suddenly, rifle in hand. "Shut up," he hissed. We all went still, listening. The thumping had stopped. For the first time since we entered White Rock Woods, there was silence. Complete and total silence. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling sound like an engine starting up. But there was no mistaking it. This wasn't mechanical. It was a deep, primal noise, and it was close. "Positions!" I barked, and the team jumped into action, forming a tight defensive circle. Weapons were drawn, eyes scanning the dark forest around us. The creature came at us fast. We didn't even see it at first, just the blur of movement as it charged out of the undergrowth. Erickson fired first, a burst of bullets into the darkness. They hit something solid, and for a moment there was silence again. Then it lunged into the clearing, and we saw it. The thing was massive, a grotesque mix of muscle and sinew, covered in matted, filthy fur. Its head was elongated like a crocodile's, with a row of jagged teeth that glistened in the firelight. But it moved on two legs, hunched over like some terrible cross between a bear and a man. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, and I've seen a lot. Clancy opened up with his shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature staggered back, but it didn't fall. It let out a scream, an unholy sound that made the air vibrate with the force of it. It wasn't just a roar of pain, it was anger, pure and unfiltered. Hutch was next, throwing an incendiary device at it. The creature dodged faster than something that size should have been able to move. The fireball exploded against a tree, sending sparks raining down on us. It charged again, and this time it caught Erickson, throwing him into a tree with a sickening crunch. The sound of his body breaking was unmistakable. Blood poured from his mouth as he slumped to the ground, unmoving. "Fall back!" I shouted, knowing that staying in the clearing was a death sentence. We scrambled back through the trees, but the creature was relentless, its heavy footsteps pounding after us. We didn't make it far. Hutch tripped over a root, and the creature was on him before he could get back up. I didn't see what it did to him, but the scream he let out told me enough. Clancy and I kept running, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chase stopped. The creature was gone, disappearing into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods where our extraction point was supposed to be. But there was no sign of a chopper, no sign of our backup. Just more silence. Clancy collapsed to his knees, panting heavily, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" he gasped. I didn't have an answer. "We need to find Erickson and Hutch," I said, even though I knew it was a lie. There was no finding them. Not alive, anyway. We waited for hours, but no help came. Eventually, we started back toward the site where Erickson had gone down. The forest seemed darker now, more oppressive. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something monstrous. But I had to find out if there was anything left of my men. When we reached the clearing, the fire had burned out, leaving only embers. Erickson's body was there, twisted and broken, but intact. Hutch's gear was scattered, blood splattered across the leaves, but his body was gone. "Where the hell did it go?" Clancy whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but we're getting out of here, now." We didn't run this time. We walked, guns drawn, every muscle tensed for the slightest sound or movement. But the creature didn't come back. Not then. By the time we reached the rendezvous point again, the chopper had finally arrived. We climbed in without a word, and I could tell the pilot knew better than to ask questions. As the chopper lifted off, I looked back at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of White Rock Woods. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. Clancy and I never spoke about what happened again. There was no need. The silence had said it all. As for me, well, I don't sleep much these days, and I don't go near the woods. Not because I'm scared. Fear stopped being a thing for me years ago, but because there's nothing left to say. Some things you just leave behind, and some things don't need words. I was standing in the middle of a dense, overgrown forest in western Oregon, trying to figure out how the hell I ended up there. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time in places like this, trekking through the wilderness with my uncle who used to work as a forest ranger. He taught me to appreciate the quiet danger of the wild. I guess that's what made me good at my job now, hunting things that most people never even realized existed. My name is Travis Fenwick, and I'm part of a specialized unit that operates under the radar, far from the eyes of the public. You wouldn't find any official records on us. We're the sort of ghosts that only exist in whispers among those who've seen what hides in the darkest corners of the world. We deal with cryptids, those creatures of myth and legend that aren't supposed to be real but are. And they're dangerous. Today, I was on a mission that had gone from bad to worse in a matter of hours. It started like any other assignment. A remote area, an old report of missing people, strange sightings, and a lot of speculation from locals. This time, it was in the Tillamook State Forest, a vast, untamed wilderness known for its beauty and mystery. But that's not why I was here. Reports had been coming in about something tearing through campsites, leaving nothing but blood and bones behind. Some said it was a bear, others whispered about a wolf bigger than a man. But the truth was worse. Much worse. My team was small, just 4 of us. Myself, Hank, an ex-Marine with a knack for explosives, Sarah, our tracker who could follow a trail through a hurricane, and Chris, our tech guy, quiet but sharp as a blade. We were the best at what we did, and we'd taken down creatures that most people only heard about in ghost stories. But this time, something felt off. The forest was too quiet, the air too thick. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. We split up to cover more ground, each of us equipped with enough firepower to level a small building. But even as we moved, I could feel it watching us. You learn to sense these things after a while. A cold dread that starts in your gut and spreads out, tightening around your chest like a vice. Whatever was out here wasn't just an animal. It was smart. Predatory. I found the first body at the edge of a clearing, or what was left of it. Hank had been seasoned, seen combat in the worst places on Earth. But what had happened to him? It wasn't quick. His body was torn open, ribs cracked like kindling, entrails strewn across the ground. But what was most unsettling was the look on his face. A mix of terror and disbelief, frozen forever in his lifeless eyes. I forced myself to move on, keeping low and quiet, my senses on high alert. I had to find Sarah and Chris. We had rules in place, protocols for when things went wrong. But this was beyond wrong. It was like the forest was swallowing us, one by one. I reached for my radio, static crackling on the other end. "Sarah, Chris, report," I whispered, hoping for anything. "Chris here. I'm at the ridge, can't find Sarah. Hank's gone, isn't he?" The despair in his voice was enough to tell me he knew what I'd found. "Stay put. I'm heading to you." I moved through the underbrush, every step careful, deliberate. The wind picked up, carrying a stench that made my stomach turn, rot and decay like something long dead. I knew what that smell meant, and it wasn't good. When I got to the ridge, Chris was already waiting, pale and wide-eyed. "What the hell is this, Trav? This isn't like anything we've faced before." He was right. This wasn't some beast acting on instinct. It was something that hunted us, and it was enjoying it. "We're dealing with something smarter," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's picking us off, one by one. We need to find Sarah, get her back, and regroup." But before we could move, there was a rustling in the bushes, followed by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Chris and I froze, weapons raised. The thing emerged from the shadows, and I could see why the locals had called it a wolf. It was massive, easily the size of a small car, with a body that was more muscle than anything else. Its fur was matted, covered in what looked like dried blood. But it wasn't just its size that made my blood run cold. It was its eyes, burning with an intelligence that no animal should possess. This was no ordinary creature. It was something else, something ancient. Chris reacted first, firing off a shot that hit the creature square in the chest. But it didn't even flinch. It lunged at him with impossible speed, jaws snapping shut around his arm before I could do anything. The scream that came out of Chris was something I'll never forget. Pure, unfiltered agony. I aimed and fired, my bullets tearing through its thick hide, but it was like trying to stop a tank with a slingshot. The thing tore Chris apart before turning its gaze on me, blood dripping from its maw. I didn't think. I just ran. Adrenaline coursed through me as I crashed through the underbrush, my only goal to get away, to survive. But it was faster. I could hear it behind me, the ground shaking with each step. I knew I couldn't outrun it, so I had to outsmart it. I spotted an old ravine up ahead, overgrown with vines and moss. If I could get it to follow me there, I might have a chance. I changed direction, heading straight for it, praying that it would be enough. The ravine was deeper than I expected, and I nearly lost my footing as I skidded to a stop at the edge. I turned just in time to see the creature charging at me, eyes locked on mine. At the last second, I threw myself to the side, hoping it would be too late for it to stop. It was. The thing went over the edge, its massive body crashing through the underbrush and down into the darkness below. I lay there, gasping for breath, waiting for the sound of it climbing back up, but it never came. I crawled to the edge, peering over. It was there, impaled on a jagged branch, its body twisted in a way that no living thing could survive. Blood pooled around it, soaking into the earth. And just like that, it was over. I didn't stay long after that. I radioed for extraction, made my way back to where the chopper would pick me up. I didn't think about Hank or Chris or Sarah, though I knew their fates. All I focused on was getting out, alive. As the helicopter lifted me out of the forest, I looked down at the trees below, now just a sea of green. Somewhere down there, that thing's body would remain, a reminder of what lurked in the shadows. I knew I'd be back out here again someday, hunting another nightmare. But for now, I was just glad to be getting the hell out of there. We found Sarah's body 2 days later, what was left of it anyway. She'd put up a fight, but in the end it hadn't been enough. The only solace I had was that the creature wouldn't be claiming any more lives. And that was that. I don't look back on what happened in those woods. There's no point. We do our job and we move on. I never planned on joining the cryptid unit. Hell, I never even thought monsters were real until the summer of 2017. I was working as a marine biologist, spending days tagging and studying the migratory patterns of sharks off the coast of North Carolina. The job paid well, and I got to spend my days out on the open water, far from the noise and chaos of city life. But one night something happened that changed everything. I was alone on the research boat. A small vessel no bigger than a fishing trawler, anchored just off Cape Hatteras. The ocean was calm, the moon casting a silver sheen across the waves. I had just finished logging data and was getting ready to call it a night when I noticed something odd on the radar. Something large and fast-moving, unlike any marine life I'd ever seen. It moved with purpose, darting in a zigzag pattern toward my boat. I watched the radar in disbelief, trying to make sense of it. Then the boat rocked violently, as if something massive had struck it from below. I rushed to the deck, peering over the side into the dark water. I expected to see a whale or maybe even a large shark. Instead, what I saw defied explanation. A massive shape as long as the boat itself glided just beneath the surface. It was smooth and black, with a thick serpentine body that moved with terrifying speed. Its head, crowned with jagged, bone-like protrusions, broke the surface for just a moment before disappearing into the depths. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. I had never seen anything like it in all my years studying marine life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed on the deck, watching the water, waiting for the creature to return. When dawn broke, I made the decision to head back to shore and report what I'd seen, though I knew how crazy it would sound. But as I motored back toward land, something even stranger happened. A sleek black helicopter appeared on the horizon, heading straight for me. It hovered above the water a few hundred yards from my boat before a man dressed in black tactical gear rappelled down onto the deck. He introduced himself as Agent Rhodes, flashing a badge that bore no recognizable government seal. "You've seen something you shouldn't have," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "We're going to need you to come with us." And that was it. Before I knew it, I was swept up into a world I never knew existed. A world where monsters were real, and there was a secret government agency tasked with hunting them down. They called it the Cryptid Unit, and Agent Rhodes was their top operative. At first, I resisted. I wanted no part of it. I was a scientist, not a soldier. But Rhodes was persuasive, and in the end, I had no choice. They knew what I had seen, and they made it clear that my life would never be the same unless I joined them. So I did. I went through the training, learned how to handle weapons, how to track and kill creatures that science had no explanation for. The years passed, and I became good at what I did. Too good, maybe. The hunts became routine. The fear that once gripped me faded into a numb sort of acceptance. But there was one mission, just a few months ago, that brought all that fear rushing back. We were sent to a remote town in the Pacific Northwest, a place called Black Creek. The town had seen a string of disappearances, all under bizarre and violent circumstances. The locals whispered about a creature in the woods, something ancient and malevolent. Rhodes and I were dispatched to investigate. Black Creek was a ghost town by the time we arrived. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. We set up a base of operations in the old town hall using thermal imaging and motion sensors to track any signs of life, or anything else. It wasn't long before we found what we were looking for. The creature struck at night, moving through the town with silent, lethal precision. We caught glimpses of it on the thermal cameras, a hulking bipedal figure with long, sinewy limbs and a hunched back. Its movements were eerily human-like, but there was nothing human about it. Rhodes and I followed it into the woods, armed to the teeth with the latest in military hardware. The forest was dense, the trees so thick they blotted out the moonlight. We moved slowly, cautiously, our rifles raised, the darkness pressing in around us. Then we heard it, a low rumbling sound, like the purr of a big cat, but deeper, more menacing. It came from all around us, echoing through the trees. We stopped, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing to see. "Stay sharp," Rhodes whispered, his voice barely audible over the thumping of my heart. Suddenly, something slammed into me from the side, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. Rhodes shouted, firing his weapon into the darkness, but it was too late. The creature was on me, its claws digging into my chest. I've faced a lot of monsters in my time, but nothing like this. It was like being attacked by a lion, only bigger, stronger, and much more intelligent. It had the face of a wolf, elongated and twisted with sharp, bone-like spines running down its back. Its eyes, those I remember clearly, were wide, unblinking, filled with an unnatural intelligence. I fought back, using everything I'd learned in my training, but it was no use. The creature was too strong, too fast. It pinned me to the ground, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I could smell its rancid breath, feel the heat of its body pressing down on me. Rhodes was shouting, firing round after round into the creature, but it barely flinched. I was going to die, there was no doubt in my mind. But then, out of nowhere, Rhodes did something I never expected. He pulled out a small device from his belt, something I'd never seen before, and activated it. The creature let out a horrific screech, its body convulsing as if it was being electrocuted. It released me, thrashing wildly before collapsing to the ground. Dead. I lay there gasping for breath, covered in blood and dirt. Rhodes crouched beside me, his face grim. "That was too close," he said, helping me to my feet. "What the hell was that?" I asked, still trying to process what had just happened. "Something we weren't supposed to see," Rhodes replied, "and something no one else will ever know about. We burned the creature's body that night, reducing it to ashes before anyone could find it. The mission was over, and we returned to base, our report classified and buried deep within the agency's archives. No one would ever know what we encountered in Black Creek, and that's how it had to be. But as I sit here now writing this down, I realize that it doesn't matter. The truth is out there, whether anyone believes it or not. Monsters are real, and they're closer than we think. And sometimes, just sometimes, they win." Rhodes walked into the room, his face as unreadable as ever. "Ready for the next one?" he asked, his voice steady. I nodded, feeling the weight of the last hunt still clinging to me, but knowing there was no other choice. We hunted the things that lurked in the dark, and there was always another hunt waiting. I strapped on my gear, checked my weapon, and followed him out into the night. The monster may have been dead, but the job was far from over. My name is Isaac Trevino, and I've spent the last 15 years tracking down things that shouldn't exist. I know how that sounds, but this isn't the delusion of a man who's seen too many horror movies. What I do is more of a practical trade, like pest control, but the pests I deal with could turn a man inside out or make him vanish without a trace. I'm part of a unit that operates far from the public eye, funded by parts of the government even conspiracy theorists don't know about. We hunt the unknown, the creatures that defy classification and logic, the things that slip between the cracks of reality. I've been stationed in a lot of remote, godforsaken places, but none of them compare to Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana. It's a place that looks like it's been forgotten by time, all moss-draped cypress trees and murky water, the air thick with decay and secrets. Most people wouldn't last a day out there, and those who do come out usually wish they hadn't gone in at all. We'd been sent to Honey Island because of the disappearances. Local authorities were baffled. People vanishing without a trace wasn't unheard of in places like this. Gators and quicksand could make short work of a body, but this was different. The reports were strange. Seasoned trappers who knew the swamp better than their own living rooms were just gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading in or out. Then the bodies started showing up, or what was left of them, torn apart like something had just shredded them for fun and left the pieces to rot in the sun. The locals called it the Rougarou, a sort of Cajun werewolf myth. But what we were dealing with wasn't a man who turned into a beast. I'd seen the aftermath too many times to believe it was something so simple. No, this was something older, meaner, something that had learned to enjoy the hunt. We arrived at the edge of the swamp just after dawn, our team of 5 armed to the teeth with weapons most folks wouldn't recognize. I won't bore you with the technical details, but let's just say they were designed to take down things a lot tougher than a grizzly. I carried a customized shotgun loaded with shells that could blow through tank armor, and a machete strapped to my back that had seen its fair share of action. Our guide was a local, a wiry old man named Beauchamp, who seemed more comfortable in the swamp than anywhere else. He'd been the one to find the last body, and from the look in his eyes, I knew he wasn't telling us everything. His hands trembled as he spoke, pointing us toward a part of the swamp even he seemed hesitant to venture into. "This ain't natural," Beauchamp muttered as we loaded up the airboat. "I've seen gators drag men under, seen the swamp take people whole. But this is something else. Something that don't belong here." I didn't need him to elaborate. I'd seen it too many times. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to be anything we were prepared for, but that's never stopped us before. The airboat ride was tense, the hum of the engine cutting through the thick silence of the swamp. The trees closed in around us, their twisted limbs casting long shadows on the water, and the deeper we went, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. This was its domain, and we were intruders. We reached a clearing where the water opened up into a stagnant pond, the surface thick with algae and who knows what else. Beauchamp killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He pointed to a spot on the far shore where the trees were denser, their roots rising out of the water like skeletal fingers. "It's in there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Last time I was here I saw something moving. Ain't going back in." I nodded, signaling the others to disembark. Beauchamp stayed with the boat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting to the tree line as if expecting something to burst out at any moment. We moved in, weapons at the ready, our breaths held as we navigated the thick underbrush. The smell hit us first, a stench of rot and decay so overpowering it made my stomach turn. We were getting close. The first sign of trouble came from our point man, Eric. He was a big guy, ex-military, the kind of person you'd want on your side in a fight. He froze mid-step, raising his fist to signal us to stop. I strained my ears, but heard nothing, just the oppressive silence of the swamp. Then I saw it just out of the corner of my eye, a ripple in the water, too large to be a fish or gator. Something massive, moving just beneath the surface. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through me as I signaled the others to spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the area. The water erupted with a force that sent Eric flying backward, his scream cut short as he hit a tree with a sickening crack. And then it was on us, faster than anything that size had a right to be. It was a blur of muscle and scales, at least 10 feet long, with a maw full of teeth that reminded me of a shark, only bigger, sharper. Its body was like an overgrown alligator, but bulkier, more feral. It moved on 4 legs, the front ones ending in claws that could slice through flesh and bone like butter. It was the eyes that unnerved me the most, though. Eyes that didn't belong to an animal, but to something that enjoyed the kill, that knew what it was doing. Ralph, another member of our team, opened fire. the sound of his rifle cracking through the swamp. The bullets hit, but they barely slowed the thing down. It lunged at him, jaws wide, and all I could do was watch as it tore into him, the wet sounds of ripping flesh filling the air. I fired my shotgun, the blast catching the creature in its side, but it only snarled and turned its attention toward me. I had a split second to react, diving to the side as it barreled past, knocking over a tree as if it were a twig. Jared and Sonia, the last of our team, took their shots, and this time the creature staggered. It wasn't invincible after all. I saw my opening and didn't hesitate. I drew the machete, charging at it with everything I had, aiming for the neck where the scales looked thinner. It roared, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around us as the blade connected, slicing deep into its flesh. Blood sprayed and I kept hacking, not stopping until the thing finally collapsed, its massive body twitching in the muck. We stood there, panting, bloodied and bruised, staring at the fallen beast. It was dead, but the sight of it, the sheer size and savagery, left us in a stunned silence. Jared was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" "No idea," I replied, wiping the blood from my face. "But it's dead now." Beauchamp hadn't moved from the boat when we returned. He took one look at us, covered in blood, our faces grim, and knew better than to ask questions. We loaded up what was left of our gear, and I glanced back at the swamp, feeling an odd mix of relief and dread. The others would believe us, not because they wanted to, but because they wouldn't have a choice. The creature's carcass, half sunken in the muck, would make sure of that. We didn't need to say a word. As we headed back, the swamp closed in behind us, its secrets sinking beneath the murky water where they belonged. I was staring at the remnants of my morning coffee when the call came in. The mug, chipped around the rim, sat on the cluttered desk of my one-bedroom apartment in Fargo, North Dakota, a city that had the dual curse of bone-chilling winters and an uncanny knack for attracting strange occurrences. My name is Nathaniel Carter, and I've been with the unit for about 10 years now, although I've stopped keeping track of time. The unit, short for the U.S. government's Cryptid Containment Division, isn't something you'll find in any official records. We deal with the things that defy explanation, the kinds of creatures that shouldn't exist but do. The assignment that came in that morning wasn't anything out of the ordinary, at least not for me. A series of disappearances had occurred in the dense forest near Lake Meticulously, a place that had always had its fair share of local legends, most of which we, in the unit, knew to be more than just stories. But what set this apart was the escalation. The local authorities had found remains this time, and the nature of the injuries suggested something far beyond the capabilities of any known predator. I packed up my gear, including the usual assortment of firearms and silver-coated blades, and headed out in my old pickup truck. The drive to the site took about 4 hours, plenty of time to go over the details in my head. There was something unsettling about this case, something that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The reports mentioned bodies that had been torn apart with such force that bones were found splintered, embedded in tree trunks like grotesque decorations. But it wasn't just the brutality, it was the precision. This wasn't a wild animal attack. It was deliberate, almost methodical. When I arrived, the local sheriff, a grizzled man named Murdoch with a face carved by years of exposure to harsh weather, met me at the entrance to the forest. His expression told me everything I needed to know. He'd seen things out here that he couldn't reconcile with his understanding of the world. "They're out there," Murdoch said, his voice low. "We found 3 bodies so far, but there's no pattern to where they're being left. It's like whatever's doing this is playing with us." I nodded, not saying much. Over the years, I'd learned that it was best to let these small-town lawmen talk. They needed to get the weight off their chests, even if I couldn't tell them the full truth about what they were dealing with. The forest was dense, the trees standing like sentinels against the bright sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the faint, acrid tang of decay. I followed Murdoch and his deputies into the woods, my hand resting on the grip of my revolver. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us, the undergrowth becoming almost impassable. We found the first body near a stream, or rather what was left of it. The sight was enough to turn the stomach of even the most hardened deputies. The corpse had been eviscerated, its chest cavity ripped open as if something had torn through it to get at the organs within. The skin around the wounds was shredded, hanging in strips that fluttered in the light breeze. "It's like a damn bear got at him," one of the deputies muttered, his face pale. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't dismember bodies like this, don't strip flesh with surgical precision. I crouched next to the remains, examining the torn edges of the skin, the splintered bones. There were deep gouges, too, that I recognized from other cases. Marks left by claws far sharper and stronger than anything nature was supposed to produce. "Murdoch," I said, standing up, "tell your men to stay back. Whatever did this is still around." He nodded grimly, ordering the deputies to fan out and secure the perimeter. They were good men, I could tell, but they were out of their depth. This was my world, one where the monsters in the dark were all too real. As I moved deeper into the woods, the sense of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, as if the very air was charged with something malignant. The trees were thicker here, their branches intertwined like the gnarled fingers of ancient, withered hands. I'd seen places like this before, sites where the veil between our world and something else had worn thin. I found the second body tangled in the roots of a massive oak. The man had been pinned to the ground, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. But it was the expression on his face that caught my attention, a look of sheer, uncomprehending terror. He had seen what was coming for him, and he hadn't stood a chance. I was about to radio Murdoch when I heard it. A low, rhythmic clicking sound, like the grinding of stone on stone. It was coming from deeper in the forest, and it was moving closer. I ducked behind a tree, drawing my revolver and cocking the hammer. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw it. It moved through the trees with a fluidity that belied its size, its long, spindly limbs ending in wickedly curved claws. Its body was covered in a matted, wiry fur that bristled as it moved, and its face, if you could call it that, was an elongated, twisted thing with a jaw that seemed to unhinge like a snake's. It was a nightmare given form, something that shouldn't exist in the waking world. I fired off 2 shots, the sound cracking through the stillness of the forest like thunder. The creature let out a hideous, chittering screech as the bullets struck it, but it didn't go down. Instead, it charged, moving faster than I could have imagined, its claws flashing as it slashed at me. I barely managed to throw myself to the side, the claws missing my face by inches. Rolling to my feet, I fired again, aiming for its chest this time. The creature staggered but kept coming, its eyes, or the empty pits where eyes should have been, fixed on me with an intelligence that was all the more terrifying for its alien nature. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched, and I braced myself for the impact. But then, with a speed that defied logic, it twisted in midair, as if struck by an invisible force, and collapsed to the ground, twitching violently. I didn't waste time. I ran over to it, firing the remaining rounds into its head, ensuring it was dead. The creature's body convulsed one last time, then lay still, its twisted form crumpled like a broken doll. Whatever it had been, it was no longer a threat. Murdoch and his deputies arrived minutes later, guns drawn, but the danger had passed. They stared at the creature's corpse with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "What the hell is that thing?" one of the deputies asked, his voice shaking. "Classified," I replied, holstering my revolver. "Get the area secured. No one comes in or out until we've cleaned this up." Murdoch nodded, his face pale but determined. He didn't ask any more questions, and I didn't offer any answers. This was the kind of thing that didn't get explained to the public, the kind of thing that got buried in official reports that never saw the light of day. As I walked back to my truck, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a cold, gnawing exhaustion. This was just another day in the unit, another monster slain, another mystery buried. But the thought that lingered in the back of my mind was this: how many more of these things were out there lurking in the dark corners of the world? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, lighting one as I leaned against the hood of my truck. The first drag did little to calm my nerves, but it was a familiar ritual, something to ground me after the chaos. Murdoch approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, looking like he wanted to say something, but not quite knowing how. "Thanks for your help, Carter," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I don't know what we would have done without you." "Just doing my job," I replied, exhaling a stream of smoke into the crisp air. He nodded, understanding that the conversation was over. As he turned to leave, I crushed the cigarette under my boot and climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life and I drove away from the scene, the weight of another encounter heavy on my shoulders, but I didn't dwell on it. In this line of work, you couldn't afford to. There was always another mission, another monster waiting to be dealt with, and I'd be ready for it when the time came. It was the kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat. That's what I hated about the job, the silence of it all. Sure, there were the obvious perks, the salary was great, and the benefits were better than most government gigs. But the job itself? Well, it's the sort of thing that makes you wish for a normal life, one where you're not tracking things that shouldn't exist, things you're told don't exist. My name is Cal Mercer, and I've been with the Department of Cryptid Containment for just over 6 years. 6 years of hunting down things that most people only talk about around campfires or in late-night horror movie marathons. I wasn't always in this line of work, though. I started out as a biology professor at a small college in Vermont. I had a quiet life, filled with the kind of routine that would bore most people to tears. But I loved it. Then, one winter night, I saw something in the woods near my home. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that changed everything. You see, once you've seen what's out there, the government likes to make sure you don't talk. They gave me 2 options: join the team or disappear. So here I am, doing things I never imagined, and on some days it feels like I'm on the edge of losing my mind. The latest assignment brought me to a remote part of New Mexico, somewhere out in the desert where the land stretched on for miles with nothing but scrub and rock. A small town named San Orfeo was where we set up shop, though calling it a town was generous, more like a forgotten crossroads where people only stopped if they had no other choice. We were chasing reports of something killing livestock, and recently a couple of hikers who had gone missing. The locals were scared, but none of them would admit it outright. But I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked over their shoulders as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. I was partnered with Jacob Tully, a guy I'd worked with a few times before. He was quiet, methodical, and had a tendency to chew tobacco that made his already gravelly voice even more guttural. We were sitting in the local diner pretending to be out-of-towners on a hunting trip while we eavesdropped on the locals. That's how we usually worked: blend in, listen, and pick up on the details that the official reports miss. The waitress, a woman who looked to be in her late 40s with tired eyes and a nervous smile, kept glancing at us like she wanted to say something. I could tell she knew more than she was letting on. "Something bothering you, miss?" I asked casually, pouring another packet of sugar into my coffee. Tully didn't look up from his menu, but I knew he was listening intently. She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "You boys really here to hunt?" I nodded. "That's right. Heard there's been some trouble around these parts. Figure we might try our luck. See what's out there." She leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice. "If you're smart, you'll get back in your car and leave. There's things out in that desert that shouldn't be disturbed. They say it's been here longer than any of us, something old and hungry." "What kind of thing?" Tully finally spoke, his eyes meeting hers. She flinched a little at the intensity of his gaze. "Can't say for sure. People who've seen it up close, well, they don't come back to tell the tale." We exchanged a look. That was our cue. After a few more pleasantries, we left the diner and headed to the town's outskirts, where the missing hikers had last been seen. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the desert, and the wind carried a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We parked our truck near a stand of Joshua trees and hiked into the rocky terrain, our gear strapped to our backs. As the light faded, we made camp and set up motion sensors and infrared cameras around the perimeter. Tully was checking the feeds while I stood on a small rise, scanning the horizon with my binoculars. The sense of unease I'd felt earlier was growing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by anything human, though. No, this was something else. Something that didn't belong. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The motion sensors went off one after another in rapid succession. Tully and I grabbed our rifles and night vision goggles, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The desert was eerily still, the only sound the soft hiss of the wind through the rocks. Then we saw it. A shape moving low to the ground, skirting the edge of our camp. It was fast, too fast for anything I'd ever seen in the wild. It looked like a cross between a lizard and a wolf, but its limbs were too long, its body too sinewy, and the way it moved was all wrong, like it was sliding over the ground rather than walking. Tully aimed his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the desert, but the thing didn't even flinch. It darted into the darkness, out of sight before I could get a clear look at it. "Damn it," Tully muttered, lowering his rifle. Didn't even slow it down. "Whatever it is, it's not natural," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "Let's fall back. Regroup. We need to figure out what we're dealing with." We retreated to the truck, locking ourselves inside while we reviewed the footage from the cameras. What we saw made my blood run cold. The creature had circled our camp multiple times, studying us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And it wasn't alone. There were at least 3 others, moving in perfect unison, their eyes glowing faintly in the night. "This isn't just some cryptid," Tully said, his voice grim. "This is a pack and they're hunting us." We had faced dangerous creatures before, Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest, the Jersey Devil in the Pine Barrens, but nothing like this. These things were coordinated, intelligent, and far more dangerous than anything we'd encountered. "We need to get out of here," I said, starting the engine. "Warn the town, get some backup." But as I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but the truck wouldn't start. "Damn it!" I cursed, slamming my fist on the steering wheel. "It's like they knew!" Before I could finish, something slammed into the side of the truck, rocking it on its wheels. Tully raised his rifle, aiming out the window, but there was nothing there. Then the creature appeared on the hood, its massive claws scraping against the glass. It was even bigger up close, its scales shimmering in the moonlight, and its mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth that looked like they could tear through steel. I didn't think, just reacted, pulling my pistol from my holster and firing through the windshield. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched sound that rattled my bones, but it didn't retreat. It clawed at the glass, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. "We need to move!" Tully shouted, kicking open the door on his side and jumping out. I followed, the 2 of us firing at the creature as we scrambled away from the truck. It followed, relentless, as if it knew it was just a matter of time before we ran out of options. Tully tried to lead it away, firing in short bursts to keep it distracted. But I knew we were running out of time. There was no way we could outrun it, not on foot, and our weapons weren't doing enough damage to slow it down. "Cal, over here!" Tully called, motioning toward a crevice in the rocks. It was narrow, just wide enough for us to squeeze through, but it might give us a chance to escape. We scrambled into the crevice, the creature snapping at our heels. The rocks tore at my clothes, leaving deep scratches in my skin, but I pushed through, desperate to get away. We reached a small cave at the end of the crevice, barely big enough to stand in. The creature clawed at the entrance, but it couldn't fit through the narrow gap. For a moment, we were safe, but I knew it wouldn't last. The creature was persistent, and it was only a matter of time before it found another way in or called its pack. "We're trapped," Tully said, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "No way out." I looked around the cave, searching for anything we could use. There was nothing, just rocks and dirt and the oppressive darkness pressing in on us. Then I remembered the dynamite we'd brought along, just in case. "We might have one last shot," I said, pulling the sticks of dynamite from my pack. "If we can collapse the entrance, maybe we can trap it in here." Tully nodded, understanding immediately. We set the charges, lighting the fuse as the creature continued to claw at the entrance. It was so close now I could feel the heat of its breath, hear the rasping sound of its lungs as it tried to force its way in. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Tully's arm and dragging him out of the cave. back through the crevice as fast as we could go. The dynamite exploded behind us, the shockwave knocking us off our feet and sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. When the dust settled, I looked back at the cave. The entrance was gone, buried under tons of rock. There was no sign of the creature. No sound except the ringing in my ears. "We did it," Tully said, his voice shaky with relief. "Yeah," I replied, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Creatures like that don't just appear out of nowhere, and they don't hunt alone. As we made our way back to the truck, I couldn't help but think about what the waitress had said. Something old and hungry. Maybe we'd stopped it. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. This wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Back in the truck, I tried the engine one last time. And this time, it roared to life. We drove back to San Orfeo in silence, the reality of what we'd faced sinking in. When we got back to town, the sheriff met us at the edge of town. I told him what had happened, showed him the video footage we'd captured. He believed us, which was a rare thing in our line of work. He promised to send a team out to secure the area, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. As we drove away from San Orfeo, I glanced back one last time. The desert stretched out before us, endless and empty, but I knew better. There were things out there, things that weren't meant to be found, and as long as they existed, so would people like me. The engine hummed steadily as we sped down the highway, leaving the desert behind, but not the memories. When I tell people that I've been working for the US government for years, they think I'm some kind of pencil pusher stuck behind a desk. If they only knew. I hunt monsters for a living. My name is Deacon Thorne, and if you're imagining some Hollywood hero with bulging muscles and a chip on his shoulder, you'd be off the mark. I'm just a regular guy with a knack for tracking and a distaste for things that go bump in the night. It's not a glamorous life, but it's mine. I don't do this job for the money. Not really. I do it because it needs doing, and no one else is stupid enough to take it on. Today I found myself in the small town of Coldwater, Montana. Population just shy of 2,000. The place is all pine trees and fog, with a chill in the air that cuts right to your bones. My unit had been called in after a series of disappearances that the local authorities couldn't or wouldn't explain. 2 men, a woman, and a child had gone missing over the past month, and every search party came back empty-handed. The locals were scared, whispering about old legends, and the sheriff was more than happy to pass the problem on to us. Coldwater wasn't the kind of place that had ever crossed my radar before. It's one of those towns where nothing ever really happens, and everyone knows everyone else's business. The kind of place where you'd think the biggest threat was a rogue bear or a cougar. But the locals had been muttering about something worse. Much worse. The sheriff, an aging man named Samuels with more gray than brown in his hair, met me outside the station. He looked me up and down like he couldn't believe the government had sent someone as unassuming as me. I didn't bother with the formalities. Time was of the essence. "They say it's the Wapiti," Samuels muttered under his breath as we walked. "Been in these parts for centuries, they say. A ghost deer that lures people into the woods and, well, they're never seen again." I'd heard tales like this before, of course. Wapiti, Wendigo, skinwalkers. They all blurred together after a while. Legends rooted in fear of the unknown, given shape by the human imagination. But there was something about the sheriff's voice, the way it quavered, that made me wonder if he believed his own words. "You really think it's a deer?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Samuel shook his head. "I don't know what to think anymore. People are disappearing and we find nothing. No blood, no bodies, just gone." He wasn't wrong. Our initial investigations had turned up precious little. No sign of struggle, no footprints, no torn clothing. Nothing but the thick, silent woods that seemed to swallow up all sound and light. The only clue was a faint, unsettling stench in the air, something metallic and sickly sweet. But it was so faint it could have been anything. And yet it lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to be dismissed. The sun was setting by the time we made it to the edge of the woods where the latest victim, a local hunter named Reuben, had disappeared. His truck was still parked there, keys in the ignition, rifle on the passenger seat. It was like he just stepped out for a moment and vanished into thin air. I looked over at Samuels, who was eyeing the tree line with the same mix of fear and suspicion that had been plaguing the town. "You can wait here if you want," I said. "No need for both of us to go wandering around out there." The sheriff almost looked relieved. He nodded, handing me a small rusted key. "Reuben's cabin's about a mile in. This'll get you inside if you need it. He kept a journal too. Might be worth a look." With a nod, I pocketed the key and made my way into the forest. The trees were thick and tall, their branches forming a canopy that let in only the faintest glimmer of twilight. The ground beneath my boots was soft with moss and pine needles, muffling my footsteps as I moved deeper into the woods. Reuben's cabin was easy enough to find, a small, weathered structure nestled between two ancient pines. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single room that was barely furnished. A bed, a table, and a few chairs were all that Reuben had needed. On the table was a journal, just as Samuels had said. I flipped through the pages, reading Reuben's notes. They started off mundane enough, talk of hunting, the weather, the usual stuff. But the last few entries were different. He wrote about a deer he'd seen, larger than any he'd ever encountered, with antlers that seemed to stretch to the sky. He'd followed it deeper into the woods, but every time he thought he was getting close, it would vanish. Then, one night, he heard something outside the cabin, something that wasn't a deer. His last entry was scrawled hastily, as if he'd written it in a hurry. "It's not a deer. God help me, it's not a deer." The stench I'd noticed earlier seemed to hang heavier in the cabin, more pronounced now that I was inside. It wasn't just metallic, it was rancid, like something had been rotting in the walls. I quickly scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source. The scent seemed to be strongest near the back wall, where an old rug was spread out across the floor. Lifting it revealed a trapdoor, the wood beneath stained dark with something that could have been blood, long dried and faded. I hesitated only a moment before prying open the trapdoor. The stench hit me full force as I descended into the dark, cramped space beneath the cabin. It was a small root cellar, lined with shelves holding old jars and canned goods. But what drew my attention was in the corner, a pile of bones, human and animal, gnawed and shattered. Among them was a skull, human, with something carved into the forehead, a symbol I didn't recognize, twisted and jagged. I backed out of the cellar, my heart pounding. This was no ordinary predator, no simple cryptid. Whatever had taken Reuben was something far worse. I secured the trapdoor and left the cabin, determined to get back to Samuels and report my findings. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The air was heavy with that rancid smell again, and it wasn't coming from the cabin. It was all around me. I reached for the rifle slung over my shoulder, cursing myself for not having it ready sooner. The trees were unnervingly still, the silence pressing in on me. And then I saw it. Movement between the trees. Something large, impossibly fast, slipping through the shadows. I caught a glimpse of antlers, but they weren't natural. They were twisted, gnarled, almost as if they were part of the creature's flesh. And the body, my God, the body was a nightmare. A grotesque amalgamation of animal parts sewn together, nothing more than a mockery of nature. I raised the rifle and fired, but the thing was too quick. It darted away, leaving only that stench and a low, echoing noise that made my skin crawl. I kept firing, hoping to hit something, anything, but it was no use. The creature circled me, always just out of sight, always just beyond my reach. I turned and ran. No shame in it. I knew when I was outmatched. The trees seemed to close in around me, the fog thickening, turning the woods into a maze. I could hear the thing behind me, moving through the trees, its steps heavy and deliberate. It wasn't in a hurry. It was playing with me. My lungs burned as I stumbled back onto the trail that led to the sheriff's car. Samuels was still there, wide-eyed and gripping his pistol with shaking hands. I yelled at him to get in the car, and we sped out of there as fast as the old cruiser could go, the creature's form vanishing in the rearview mirror. We reached the edge of town, where the lights of Coldwater's few streets were a welcome sight. Samuels pulled over, his hand still trembling as he looked at me. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't have an answer for him. Not a good one. "Something that should have stayed in those woods," I said, checking the rifle. I wasn't sure if it was dead or if it was just letting us go for now. But one thing was clear. We were outmatched, and we needed more than just bullets to deal with it. In the following days, I wrote up my report as dry and factual as possible. The creature, whatever it was, didn't fit into any known category. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before Coldwater and would be here long after. We closed off the woods, declaring them unsafe for the time being, and quietly made plans to bring in a team more suited for dealing with the unknown. As for me, I'm moving on to the next job. This one's out of my hands now. Coldwater will just be another mark on the map, another town with its own secrets that most people will never know about.